So steps to a share acquisition, and this is specific to unlisted companies. Also, we are looking at in terms of the first time that the shares are acquired. So we are like generally looking at cases where a new investor is coming in and taking it over from the founders directly, not from the founders as well as investors. So approach, this is very relevant. So usually you will find that acquirer, who is the person who wishes to acquire or who is looking to have a dominant stake, will approach the management of the target entity. Okay, it will not be the target entity approaching the acquirer. That is also a difference in terms of investment. In terms of investment, you will largely find the founders approaching the investors. Okay, in an acquisition, it is also possible, although, that the founders are approaching an entity in order to be acquired, if they are in such a state and they are looking to be acquired by someone else. Okay, they want to be acquired, then founders can also be approaching specific entities which are likely to acquire them. But largely, it will be the acquirer who has identified that this entity is a proper fit for me and I want to acquire this entity, or it will be very well combined with my business. It will give me an outreach. It will give me certain things I'm looking for. Acquirer will approach the target entity, okay, because they believe that that entity is a very specific fit, and then obviously the target entity can accept or decline, or they can negotiate. All of these things can happen, but largely the acquirer will approach the target entity. Okay, while in terms of investment, it is usually the investee who will approach the investor. Okay, although there have been instances of companies which are so much on a growth track that they just go and they'll say to the investors that we are looking for this much investment, things like that. Okay, they'll kind of dictate the terms there. So approach will be usually by an investee to investor, but an acquirer to a target. Okay, and we are not looking for hostile acquisitions in unlisted entities. In unlisted, can really not find hostile acquisitions taking place where the management is not willing, because it's the management who is going to divest the stake. Now, if they are not willing to proceed forward, then how are you going to really enter into the business of the company and take it over in a hostile manner? It's not possible, because the stake is not held by public. It is held largely by the management or the existing investors. So, like in that, a hostile takeover or a hostile acquisition is not possible. However, there can be situations where leading investors kind of dominate the will of the founders and want to sell over the company to someone else. To that extent, you can say that it's a bit hostile to the founders, because the leading investor is kind of calling the shots and they want to just sell the entity. Okay, they have put a huge amount of money. They lead the consortium of the investors and they want to sell the entity off, irrespective of whether the founders want or not, because founders have a very minimum stake. Okay, now this is possible that there is an element of hostility involved here, and they kind of proceed to sell off the company to the external investors. But other than that, like usually you will not find, and that's also possible where you have things like drag along clauses, which are really dangerous in a shareholders agreement. Okay, so usually hostility will not be there with unlisted companies. It can be in listed company cases, but it will not be there in case of unlisted entity. Term sheets. Term sheets, again, like I'm saying, it will usually come from an investor where the company is looking for investment. Okay, or an acquirer where the acquirer is looking to put the money into the entity. Whoever is putting the money basically is kind of the person who will dictate the terms or will lay down the terms. But what happens is that if the companies or the investee entities are really strong enough, then they can also negotiate, and they can also have terms in the term sheet which are very very favorable to them. It depends on what is the balance of power or what is the negotiation of power between both the sides. Okay, so that's what goes down into the term sheet. And then obviously, if someone is putting money, there will be a due diligence that is carried out. The greater the stake, the more the depth of the due diligence, right? Because you want a really huge stake into an entity, you're going to check everything, and you want to ensure that your investment is going to the right place. So, and if it is a really limited amount of investment which is not an acquisition, then it will not be like an in-depth due diligence. Certain things you will check in order to ensure that your investment is going to get the returns. But any kind of equity investment, and we are talking of shares, okay, shares can be equity or preference, but largely equity investments involve an element of risk. So you will take some degree of risk, for sure you will be taking a risk. That's about the due diligence and the comprehensiveness of the due diligence. Okay. So now once you are through that stage, obviously you will go into the approval stage, because you want both the entities, managements and owners to approve it. So the board and the shareholders of both the entities have to say yes, okay, go ahead, for the investor, for the acquirer to go ahead and acquire, for the target entity to go ahead and get acquired or be acquired. Okay. So there will be very specific approvals at each stage for the board and the shareholders. Those approvals will then be brought into place, and it may not be acted immediately, but in unlisted entities, usually things tend to move very, very fast, because it is not supposed to be dependent on someone else's approvals. Okay. And it is largely contract driven. So you will always have everything bottom lined very clearly. You will have the term sheet, you will have like your due diligence period, you will have a draft of an agreement, everything ready, and you just kick it off and start executing it after that. Okay, so your approvals will be relatively very, very fast in terms of unlisted entities. Most entities will have very short gaps between board and shareholders meetings, and they will take a consent for a shorter notice and progress and get all the approvals in place. Okay, if it is not a regulated entity, if it is regulated, of course the additional element of getting an approval of the regulator comes into place. But if it's not, then it's just internal approvals that are required to be taken. It will move very fast. Okay. Transaction documents, then these are the exact documents that will be executed. So now what the documents through which the transaction is actually taking place, okay, through which the shares are being sold or being subscribed. We'll come to that, what happens after that. But the transaction document actually will then be entered into, executed, done and dusted after the approval is in place. Okay. And then you naturally progress to complete the transaction. Okay. In terms of how it is agreed in the transaction document. Okay. There will be a payment of consideration, and there will be transfer or the issue of shares, as is the case, because we are talking share acquisitions. So there has to be a transfer, or there has to be an issue of shares. Something has to be, okay, where the shares are given to the acquirer, right? So that, and the acquirer will make a payment. Payment can be in cash, non-cash, whatever manner both of them have agreed to do it. But it will be the payment actually of the consideration and the transfer or the issue of shares. And then post completion compliance, whatever filing you required, whatever changes you need to require to make in your registers, whatever changes you need to make in your accounts, okay, all of these things will be taken care of. And then once the transaction is completed, everything is done and dusted, then you will only have things which are an ongoing monitoring. okay, of the covenants in the transaction documents, because many transaction documents will have ongoing covenants. Okay, it will not be stopped that once the payment of consideration is made, everything is over. So, like, the transaction is over and it's completed. So, fine, it's the expiry of the transaction document. That's not how it will be. There will be ongoing covenants that are there in the documents, which can relate to information, which can relate to non-compete, which can relate to, let's say, lock-in or stopping the transfer of shares, which can relate to having someone on the board on an ongoing basis, things like this. Okay, so ongoing monitoring and implementation of the covenants in the transaction documents has to take place and continue until there is something else which is entered into, which overrides everything in the transaction document. So let us say now in an even bigger investor or acquirer is coming into place. Okay, so they will enter into a new document and that will override everything that is there here, because they will buy away everybody's stake. So that kind of thing can also happen, right?